My desk was gone. Not messy. Not relocated. Gone. 12 years of files. Framed certifications. The small brass nameplate that read Denise Scott, Director of Regulatory Compliance, all erased before 8:30 in the morning. I can't change anything. Like the weather outside. It's snowing. And maybe I'll tell my story a little slower. And what about where you live? What's the temperature like right now, if you're still listening? Please share your lucky number to keep the conversation warm. Just then, the head of human resources walked in and didn't even lower her voice. Operational restructuring. Your new workspace is downstairs. Downstairs meant the basement. No windows. Concrete walls painted a tired gray. My office was wedged beside an archive room stacked with outdated policy binders, most of which I had written. By 9:15, Mark Reynolds made his ceremonial walkthrough. Crisp suit. New COO, shine still intact. You're too procedural, he said, glancing around like the air itself offended him. We need agility. Lean thinking. I designed the compliance architecture that qualified this company for a pending federal contract worth $240 million, 417 pages of risk protocols, 3 external audits passed without a single material finding. That wasn't procedural. That was eligibility. Mark preferred buzzwords. He'd been here 6 weeks. I'd been here long enough to remember when payroll almost bounced. I understood exactly what this was. Constructive dismissal. Make the environment uncomfortable enough. Isolate the authority. Cut the oxygen wait for resignation. Mark leaned casually against the metal cabinet. If you're not comfortable, we can discuss a transition package. There it was. Polite exile. For a moment, humiliation burned hot and clean. Basement? Archives. The woman who built the guardrails parked next to storage boxes. I folded my hands on the temporary desk. No, I said evenly. I'll adjust. He smiled like the problem had solved itself and walked away. When the door shut, the silence felt deliberate. I opened my laptop, logged into the Federal Supplier Compliance Registry. My name still sat there in bold under Lead Compliance Officer for the $240 million submission awaiting final review. They moved my desk. They forgot to move the paperwork. The following section contains some fictional elements and is AI assisted for storytelling and educational purposes, and is completely unrelated to any individual or group. I hope you enjoyed this story. If not, please get some rest, stay healthy, and see you again soon. Exile did not end with the basement. It escalated quietly, within a week. My calendar emptied. Meetings I had chaired for years proceeded without me. Email chains discussing the federal submission suddenly excluded my address. Status reports that once required my signature were reassigned to a 28-year-old operations manager who still confused internal controls with workflow preferences. Mark called it modernization. I called it strategy. I had written 417 pages of the compliance manual they now treated like optional reading. I had personally certified the internal control framework that brought us into alignment with federal acquisition regulation standards. My signature sat on the last 3 audit confirmations. Those weren't decorative details. They were qualifying conditions. When I passed Mark in the hallway, he smirked. It's just paperwork. Denise, we're streamlining. Just paperwork. That paperwork positioned us for a $240 million federal contract now awaiting final approval. And when I reviewed the live submission file through authorized access, I noticed something inconvenient. My name remained listed as Lead Compliance Officer. No amendment, no update, no disclosure of role change. Anger pressed against my ribs. Tight and controlled. If I had truly been replaced, procurement regulations required notification within 72 hours of any material change in key personnel, so I drafted a single sentence. Neutral, clinical, please confirm whether my role change has been reported to federal procurement. I copied legal. Silence followed, thick, strategic. 40 minutes later, my phone lit up. The CFO wanted to speak with me privately. The CFO did not waste time on pleasantries. He closed my basement door, lowered his voice. and went straight to risk if I was no longer functioning in an equivalent capacity as lead compliance officer. Federal procurement rules required disclosure within 72 hours of any material change in key personnel. 72 hours was not a suggestion. It was a regulatory clock. I nodded. I already knew. Upstairs. Mark reacted exactly as I expected. "We're not notifying anyone," he snapped when legal raised the issue. "This is internal restructuring." Internal did not override federal disclosure obligations. Calmly, I referenced the applicable Federal Acquisition Regulation Clause covering material changes in designated personnel tied to contract eligibility. The language was unambiguous. If authority, reporting structure, or scope materially shifted, notification was mandatory. Failure to disclose could be interpreted as misrepresentation. Mark's jaw tightened. He pivoted fast. By late afternoon, HR updated the internal directory. My title changed from Director of Regulatory Compliance to Administrative Support, Operations. My reporting line moved 2 levels down. My system permissions were quietly reduced. It was clumsy. It was transparent. And it was time-stamped. I did not argue. I archived. Screenshots of the directory revision. Copies of the revised reporting structure. Email confirmations reflecting removal from oversight responsibilities. I exported metadata showing the exact time of each modification. Documentation is neutral. Documentation does not shout. By the end of the day, the regulatory clock was still ticking. Mark believed reclassification erased exposure. In reality, it deepened it. If my role had been downgraded while the federal submission still listed me as key compliance personnel, that discrepancy now existed in 2 places. Before leaving, I drafted a factual memo outlining the change in working conditions and responsibilities. No accusations, no adjectives, just dates, titles, and scope adjustments. Then I submitted it through the company's compliance hotline, administered by an independent third-party vendor. Once filed, it triggered mandatory review protocols. 72 hours suddenly felt much shorter. Pressure does not explode all at once. It accumulates in emails, 2 days after my hotline submission. The Federal Procurement Portal issued an automated personnel verification request. The notification went to legal, finance, and the designated contact for key compliance personnel. My name was still listed there. The subject line was Clinical Request for Confirmation, Key Personnel Status. By mid-morning, I was summoned upstairs. Mark didn't bother to sit. "You're sabotaging the company," he said. "Pacing. This review was triggered because of your stunt." I folded my hands. "I am complying with disclosure obligations. That's not your call anymore." "It is," I replied evenly. "If my name remains attached to the submission." Legal counsel cleared her throat before he could respond. The procurement system cross-referenced active submissions with personnel records. Any discrepancy between listed authority and internal designation prompted verification. The timing aligned precisely with the 72-hour regulatory window. Mark tried to reframe it. "We restructured internally. That doesn't require federal drama." Counsel didn't smile. If her role was materially altered and not disclosed, it could. Silence followed, heavy and procedural. By afternoon, finance modeled exposure scenarios. If the $240 million contract were suspended pending review, projected revenue for the next fiscal year would drop by 18%. Stock volatility was not theoretical. It was measurable. Mark cornered me near the elevators. "All of this because you can't handle a desk move. This is about accuracy," I said, "not furniture." The pressure shifted from personal to institutional. Emails multiplied. Legal drafted a response to procurement requesting additional time for internal clarification. That request alone signaled uncertainty. Then the situation tightened further. Late that evening, I learned through a finance contact that a private investment fund was in advanced negotiations to acquire 30% equity. As part of due diligence, they had formally requested a review of compliance culture, governance controls, and key personnel stability. My reassignment now existed in 3 overlapping systems: internal HR records, federal procurement filings, and investor due diligence materials. Pressure was no longer theoretical. It was documented, and documentation travels. Strategy requires timing. By the time the investment fund's due diligence request circulated, I had already compiled my record. I submitted a formal memorandum to Legal and Human Resources, documenting the sequence of changes: relocation to the basement workspace without business justification, removal from executive meetings, reduction of system permissions, reassignment of decision authority, and alteration of title to administrative support. Each entry included dates, timestamps, and corresponding email confirmations. No commentary, just facts. Constructive dismissal is not about hurt feelings. It is about materially altering working conditions to pressure resignation. I did not use the term casually. I used it precisely. Mark confronted me within the hour. "You're overreacting," he said, voice tight. "This is restructuring. Everyone adjusts." "I have adjusted." I replied. "I've documented." That distinction mattered. Internal counsel requested a closed-door session with finance. I was not invited. But information moves quickly when risk becomes personal. If I could demonstrate that my authority had been effectively stripped while my name remained tied to the federal submission, the company faced dual exposure potential misrepresentation in procurement filings and a labor investigation for constructive dismissal tied to a key compliance role. Losing the $240 million contract was only one scenario. Federal scrutiny of governance practices was another. Investors read those reports. By late afternoon, counsel asked to speak with me directly. The question was measured: had I resigned? Had I requested reassignment? Had I consented to the change in scope? No. I answered to each. Mark attempted to contain the narrative. "She's positioning herself for leverage." Counsel did not engage the accusation. Leverage is irrelevant. Documentation is not. That evening, an external development accelerated everything. Federal procurement sent a follow-up communication requesting interviews with designated key compliance personnel to confirm continuity of oversight prior to final contract award. The listed name under that designation remained unchanged. Mine, for the first time since my desk disappeared. Mark stopped speaking in slogans. He understood what the interview meant. If I confirmed diminished authority, disclosure failures became undeniable. If I contradicted the record, I risked personal liability. The clock restarted. Strategic counterattack does not require volume. It requires alignment between fact and regulation had just requested my calendar availability, if you believe documenting the basement transfer, the access cuts, and filing a formal constructive dismissal record was the right move. Leave a 1 in the comments, because when you speak up, it shows that compliance and integrity still matter. Public silence is louder than argument. When the Federal Procurement Office scheduled the verification meeting, the invitation arrived through legal with precise language confirmation of continuity in key compliance oversight prior to award determination. My name remained attached to the submission, so my attendance was mandatory. The meeting was held in the executive conference room I had not been allowed to enter for weeks. Mark was already seated when I walked in. He attempted control before introductions finished. "She's in transition," he said quickly. "Operational realignment. We're streamlining." I took my seat. "No notice of transition has been submitted to the Federal Registry," I said evenly. "My designation remains unchanged. The procurement representative, a senior analyst with no visible patience for theatrics, reviewed her file. Our system reflects Ms. Scott as lead compliance officer for the pending $240 million submission. We require confirmation that oversight authority remains intact. The question was procedural. The implications were not." Mark leaned forward. "Internally, we've adjusted reporting lines. Has her authority been altered?" the analyst asked again. This time without qualifiers. The room shifted. Legal counsel glanced at me, then at Mark. Finance avoided eye contact. Words matter in federal proceedings. So does omission. I answered only what was asked. My system access and decision authority were reduced on record earlier this week. Silence followed. Not dramatic silence, regulated silence. The kind that settles when liability becomes measurable. The analyst made a note. If authority has materially changed and was not disclosed within the required time frame, that may constitute a misrepresentation under procurement standards. Mark's confidence fractured. That's an overstatement. It's a compliance determination, she replied. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. Controlled power is not about volume. It is about accuracy delivered in the correct form. I did not accuse. I did not dramatize. I confirmed facts already documented. As the meeting adjourned, legal requested a private session with the procurement office to clarify internal inconsistencies. Clarify meant contain, but the real tension lingered in one unspoken truth. If anyone in that room provided false information to protect optics, it would not be a public relations issue. It would be federal fraud. Exposure does not arrive with flashing lights. It arrives in spreadsheets. 2 days after the federal verification meeting, the investment fund conducting due diligence requested an urgent call with senior leadership. Their analysts had cross-referenced procurement filings, internal HR records, and governance disclosures. The discrepancies were no longer theoretical. According to their summary, the chief operating officer had downgraded a designated key compliance officer without filing required updates in federal records. The submission for the $240 million contract still listed uninterrupted oversight. Internally, that oversight had been reduced. Externally, it had not. Risk multiplied. I was not invited to the initial investor call, but transcripts circulate when stakes rise. One analyst reportedly asked, "Why was a key regulatory architect reassigned without disclosure?" Another noted, "This presents governance instability." Mark attempted to reframe it as culture reform. In the follow-up meeting, which I did attend, he said bluntly, "She's weaponizing bureaucracy. We're modernizing operations, and she's resisting." I answered calmly, "I am preserving eligibility. Federal contracts are conditional on accurate representation of key personnel." "That's semantics," he shot back. Number one replied, "It's qualification." The investment fund's representative did not argue tone. He focused on exposure. If the contract is delayed or suspended due to compliance discrepancies, projected revenue declines materially, that affects valuation. Optics had been Mark's strategy from the beginning. Lean language, visual restructuring, symbolic authority shifts. But optics collapse when documentation contradicts presentation. Legal confirmed that any misalignment between internal authority and external filings must be corrected immediately or risk regulatory escalation. Finance added numbers to the tension potential suspension. 18% revenue reduction. Investor withdrawal clauses for the first time. The issue was no longer about my desk, my title, or my access. It was about governance credibility. Mark's final attempt was personal. "You're hurting the company. I'm protecting its standing," I said. An hour later, the board issued notice of an emergency session to review compliance oversight and executive conduct. Exposure had moved upstairs. Reckoning rarely sounds dramatic. It sounds procedural. The board meeting lasted 3 hours. I was called in during the second hour. After legal had presented their analysis, the conclusion was direct. If the $240 million federal contract were suspended or revoked due to undisclosed changes in key personnel. Individual accountability could attach to the executive who authorized the restructuring. There was no ambiguity about who signed the order relocating my role. Mark had. The general counsel stated it carefully. If a material change in designated compliance authority occurred without timely disclosure, liability exposure may extend beyond the entity. Silence followed. Not defensive, calculating. When I was asked to clarify, I repeated only what was documented. My workspace was moved to the basement without operational necessity. My system access was reduced. My reporting authority was altered. My title was changed internally, while my designation remained unchanged externally. No adjectives, just sequence. Mark tried one last reframing. This was a strategic realignment. The CFO did not engage the language. He engaged the numbers. This risk is tied directly to your restructuring process, he said. Looking at Mark, had the authority remained intact or been properly disclosed, we would not be facing procurement scrutiny. It was the first time accountability was spoken aloud without cushioning. Legal then outlined the recovery path. Immediate corrective disclosure, written confirmation of compliance continuity, formal acknowledgement that oversight authority had not been materially diminished, or restoration if it had. The procurement office responded within 24 hours. The contract would proceed, pending confirmation that compliance leadership stability was secured and governance oversight reinforced. The board's decision followed. The contract was retained. However, continued investor participation and federal confidence required a change in compliance oversight reporting structure, effective immediately. Compliance would report directly to the Board Audit Committee. Mark's restructuring authority over my function was revoked. Reckoning does not always remove the contract. Sometimes, it removes control. Power does not leave the room with a shout. It shifts with a vote. The board convened again 48 hours after the corrective disclosures were filed with federal procurement. The audit committee presented its findings documentation, confirmed that compliance authority had been materially altered without corresponding external notification. Investor due diligence flagged governance instability. Legal outlined exposure avoided only because the discrepancy had been addressed before award suspension. Then came the motion. The chair summarized it in neutral language: executive accountability for failure in governance oversight. The vote was not dramatic. It was decisive. Mark Reynolds was asked to resign. Effective immediately. For what the official statement described as failure in governance, oversight, and risk management judgment. He did not argue. He did not look at me. I felt no surge of triumph, only release after the vote. The board addressed structure. Compliance would report directly to the audit committee. My title as Director of Regulatory Compliance was reinstated with full authority, system access restored, and oversight responsibilities reaffirmed in writing. No one framed it as a personal victory. It was framed as alignment with regulatory expectation. That distinction mattered. I had not demanded reinstatement. I had not negotiated leverage. The federal submission, investor scrutiny, and internal documentation required continuity of qualified oversight. The record dictated the outcome. When the meeting adjourned, the chair asked if I had any comments. Yes, I said. I would like the reporting structure and independence of compliance to be formalized in the corporate governance policy, not dependent on executive preference. Legal nodded. The request was reasonable. Independence reduces risk. It was added to the resolution. Later, as I returned to my office no longer in the basement, I understood something clearly. This was never about a desk or a title. It was about preserving eligibility, protecting governance, and ensuring that compliance could not be repositioned for optics again. Release of power is quiet. Mark lost authority. The contract remained, and compliance no longer reported to ambition. Moving my desk back upstairs felt procedural, not triumphant. Facilities rolled it into a glass-walled office overlooking the same corridor where I had once been told to adjust. No applause, just restored access, reinstated authority, and a governance memo circulated company-wide. During the next audit committee briefing, someone asked whether I had intended to challenge Mark directly. I never fought him, I said. I confronted the risk. That distinction settled the room. Mark's resignation was finalized under the language already released: failure in governance oversight. There was no public scandal, no dramatic exit, just a leadership update and a reminder about accountability standards. Investors confirmed their 30% acquisition would proceed. Federal procurement issued formal notice that the $240 million contract would move forward without suspension. Operationally, The company survived. Culturally, it shifted. Compliance now reported independently to the board. Key personnel changes required documented review before implementation. Governance training became mandatory for executive leadership, not because I demanded it, because exposure made it necessary. A junior analyst stopped by my office later and asked quietly, "Was it worth it?" "Yes," I said. Accuracy always is. This was never revenge. I did not set out to destroy a career or embarrass a superior. I refused to let documentation diverge from reality. When representation determines eligibility, precision is not optional. They moved my desk to the basement. I moved the company back into compliance. There's something most people don't tell you about workplace humiliation. It tests your discipline more than your pride. When they moved me to the basement, I had two choices: react emotionally or respond strategically. I chose documentation over outrage. I chose policy over ego. And that choice didn't just protect me. It protected the company from losing a $240 million contract and damaging its credibility. The real lesson isn't about winning against someone. It's about understanding the system well enough that you don't have to shout to be heard. Integrity feels quiet in the moment. Sometimes it even feels lonely. But precision, patience, and knowing the rules can turn pressure into leverage. If you were in that position, isolated, underestimated, pushed aside, what would you do? Would you walk away, or would you stand firm and let the facts speak? I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? If this story meant something to you, don't underestimate the impact of a small action. One subscription helps stories like this reach people who feel trapped in silence at work. One like tells the algorithm that accountability still matters. One share might land in front of someone who needs the courage to document instead of quit. When you engage, you're not just supporting a channel, you're helping spread a standard. And sometimes, that's exactly how change begins. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.